The milk was the color of old pearls, thick and swirling in the bottom of the bucket, and it was the only thing of its kind for 100 miles. Elspeth clutched the handle, her knuckles white. Beyond her cabin door, the world was the color of dust and despair. The man standing on her porch, Mr. Sterling, was the richest man in the county, and his face was a mask of false concern stretched thin over a skeleton of raw need. His prize-winning herd, the pride of the territory, was gaunt-ribbed and dry, their magnificent horns seeming to weigh down their sorrowful heads. His children, he said, had forgotten the taste of milk. Elspeth looked past him, at the heat shimmering off the baked clay of the road, at the brittle skeletons of what had once been cornfields. She thought of the laughter, the pitying looks, the way the whole town had agreed she had lost her mind. She thought of the tiny, shivering creature she had carried home in her arms, a thing worth less than nothing. And now this. The man who had led the chorus of scorn had come to her door to beg. 2 years earlier, it had all begun with an ending. It was calving season, and Jedediah Gable's herd was a fine one, second only to Sterling's. But nature is not sentimental. One of his cows had thrown a calf so small and frail it seemed an apology. It was a heifer, dun-colored with a white splash over one eye that looked like a tear. The mother, a broad-backed, sensible animal, took one look, gave a low moo of biological refusal, and turned away. The herd followed suit. The calf, shivering and wet, tried to stand on legs like bent twigs and fell again and again. Jedediah watched, his face grim. No use, he'd said to the air. Won't survive the night. Elspeth had been there to buy a sack of seed corn, though she knew she was paying too much. She watched the small creature struggle, its desperate, silent plea for a world that had already rejected it. I'll take her, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the cold spring air. Jedediah turned, surprised. Take her? What for? She's butcher meat, and not even enough for a decent stew. I'll give you $1 for her, $1 with a fortune she didn't have, the last of her egg money. He stared at her, as if she'd proposed setting fire to his barn. Laughter rumbled in his chest. $1? For that scrap? Done. He pocketed the coin before she could change her mind, his eyes twinkling with the pleasure of a lopsided deal. The whole town heard about it by noon. Elspeth Croft, the woman alone on that worthless patch of clay her father had broken his heart on, had paid $1 for a dying calf. They called it Croft's folly. Mr. Sterling, leaning against the post of the general store, drawled to anyone who would listen. Some folks will pay good money for a headstone. Seems Miss Croft just bought a living 1 inch. The laughter that followed was not kind. Elspeth heard it, but she did not reply. She was at home, wrapping the calf in an old wool blanket and patiently trying to get it to take a finger dipped in watered-down milk from her own aging cow. The arithmetic was brutal. $1 for the calf. The cost of milk to feed it, milk she could have sold or churned. The time spent, which she could have used mending the fence or clearing stones from the field that grew more rocks than grain. It was a foolish bargain. She knew it, but as the calf finally latched on, its weak mouth pulling feebly, she felt a flicker of something stubborn and defiant. She would not let it die. She named the calf Button, for a perfect, white circle of hair on its nose. The name was a secret between her and the animal, a small rebellion against the town's verdict. The first few weeks were a relentless accounting of survival. Elspeth rose before dawn, her breath misting in the cold cabin, to warm milk on the stove. She'd carry the bucket out to the lean-to, where Button slept on a bed of clean straw. The calf was still weak, and feeding was a slow, frustrating process. More milk seemed to end up on Elspeth's dress and the shivering animal's hide than in its belly. At night, she'd sit by the low fire, mending clothes by lamplight, and do the math in her head. So many ounces of milk per day, multiplied by the weeks until the calf could graze. So many eggs sold to pay for the salt and flour she couldn't produce herself. Each day was a small, quiet war fought against the numbers that all pointed toward failure. Her own cow, Old Daisy, was a poor producer, giving just enough for the house and a little for Button. It was not a sustainable equation. The town's mockery continued, though it softened into a kind of pity. Women would see her in the store, and press a loaf of bread into her hands. For you, dear. A body needs their strength. They never mentioned the calf, but it hung in the air between them. Mr. Sterling would tip his hat with an exaggerated flourish, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Keeping busy with your investment, Miss Croft? He'd ask, his voice carrying to the men sitting on the porch. Elspeth would just nod, her face calm, and walk on. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not yet right. She was just determined. One afternoon, while gathering wild herbs at the edge of her property, she met Frau Greta. The old German woman lived in a tiny cottage set so deep in the woods that most people forgot she was there. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of a life lived elsewhere, and she spoke in a thick, gentle accent. She saw Elspeth kneeling by a patch of stubborn-looking weeds. That one, Frau Greta said, pointing a gnarled finger. The deep roots. It is not pretty, but it holds the water when the sun is a hammer. Elspeth looked up, startled. Frau Greta's eyes, pale blue and sharp, were not looking at the plant, but at her. You are the one with the little cow, the old woman stated. It wasn't a question. Elspeth nodded. Frau Greta smiled, a slow creasing of her wrinkled face. Good. The stone the builder refuses often becomes the cornerstone. Remember this. She then proceeded to show Elspeth plants the other ranchers ignored. Tough, deep-rooted chicory that cattle found bitter but was full of minerals. Vetch that tangled in the scrub but fixed nitrogen in the poor soil. Plantain that was dismissed as a weed but soothed an aching stomach. She spoke of the land not as an enemy to be conquered but as a partner with its own language. Elspeth listened, absorbing the quiet wisdom. She went home that day with more than just a basket of herbs. She had an aphorism to hold onto, a piece of hard-won truth that felt like the first solid stone laid for a foundation no one else could yet see. A few weeks later, the boy appeared. His name was Silas, a thin, quiet shadow of a child who lived with a cousin who had too many of his own. He was barely 10, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much and a habit of making himself as small as possible. He started lingering by Elspeth's fence line, watching her with Button in the small paddock. He never spoke, just watched. Elspeth, remembering her own lonely childhood, didn't chase him off. One day, she was struggling to lift a bucket of water, her back aching from a long day of clearing stones. Silas slipped under the fence rail, silent as a stray cat. He took one side of the handle, his small hands gripping the wood. Together, they carried it to the trough. He still didn't speak, but from that day on, he was there. He arrived after his morning chores at his cousin's and stayed until dusk. He learned the rhythm of the place. He helped muck out the stall, hauled water, and sat quietly while Elspeth milked Daisy. His favorite task was grooming Button. He would brush her dun-colored coat until it shone, talking to her in a low, constant murmur that he never used with people. He told the calf about the hawk he'd seen that morning, about the shape of the clouds, about a dream he'd had. In the presence of the rejected animal, the silent boy found his voice. Elspeth would watch them from the cabin door, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. The three of them formed a small, unspoken family against the world. The town noticed the boy's presence, of course. It was just one more piece of evidence for their verdict on Elspeth Croft. First a worthless calf, now a half-wild stray of a boy. She was collecting rejects, they whispered. It wasn't charity. It was a sign of her own strangeness, her inability to fit into the proper order of things. But Elspeth, Silas, and Button were building their own order. By June, Button was no longer a shivering scrap. Her legs had straightened, her coat was glossy, and her eyes were bright and intelligent. She was not a large animal, not like the broad-back heifers in Sterling's fields, but she was whip-tough and agile. She followed Elspeth and Silas like a dog, nudging their hands for a scratch behind the ears. The summer was long and dry, a faint prelude of what was to come. The creek that marked the edge of Elspeth's property shrank to a muddy ribbon. The grass in the common pasture grew sparse and brown. But on Elspeth's land, following Frau Greta's advice, she had encouraged the tough, deep-rooted forage. Button learned to eat the chicory and vetch, thriving on the very things other cattle ignored. Elspeth spent her days digging. She deepened her well by hand, another task the town found peculiar. It was man's work, they said, but Elspeth had no man, so it became her work. Day after day, she descended into the cool dark, hauling up buckets of clay and rock, until the water at the bottom was a foot deeper. It was back-breaking, soul-wearying labor, but each night, when she saw the clear water in the trough and watched Button drink her fill, she knew it was necessary. The arithmetic was changing. The cost of the calf was a sunk investment. The daily accounting was now about water and work and the slow, steady growth of a creature everyone had given up on. The seasons turned. Button grew from a gangly heifer into a sleek, small-boned cow. She was still smaller than the other cattle in the valley, a fact Mr. Sterling pointed out with satisfaction. "See," he said one day at the mercantile, loud enough for half the town to hear. "You can't make a silk purse from sow's ear. She's a runt. Always will be." He was right about her size, but he was wrong about everything else. What Button lacked in bulk, she possessed in resilience. She moved with a nimble grace over the rocky soil of Elspeth's land, never stumbling, never tiring. She had an uncanny ability to find the last green shoots in a dry pasture, a quiet intelligence in her soft brown eyes. She was perfectly suited to the marginal land she lived on, a fact that escaped everyone who judged livestock by size and weight alone. The first winter was hard. Snow buried the fences, and the wind howled with a personal fury. Elspeth and Silas spent their days keeping the path to the lean-to clear and ensuring Button had fresh water that wasn't frozen solid. Elspeth's meager harvest of vegetables, stored in the root cellar, dwindled faster than she liked. The math began again in her head each night. So many jars of beans left. So many weeks until the thaw. It was during that long, cold winter that Elspeth noticed the sky. She had always watched the weather, as any farmer must, but now she watched it with a new intensity. The sunsets were too vivid, the air too clear. There was a brittleness to the world, a lack of deep, resonant moisture in the soil, even when the snow melted. She mentioned it to Frau Greta, who simply nodded, her gaze distant. "The land is thirsty," the old woman said. "It has been thirsty for a long time. A great thirst is coming." That spring, Button came into her first heat. Elspeth had no bull and no money to pay for stud service from a prize animal like Sterling's. Instead, she made a deal with Jedediah Gable, the man who had sold her Button. He had a sturdy, unremarkable bull, and he agreed to the service in exchange for a dozen of Elspeth's chickens. It was a fair trade, and it caused another small ripple of amusement in the town. Breeding a runt to a common bull, they said, was just doubling down on mediocrity. Elspeth ignored them. She trusted Button. She trusted the lessons of the land Frau Greta had taught her. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. As the months of Button's pregnancy passed, the great thirst Frau Greta had predicted began to make itself known. The spring rains were short and spiteful, barely enough to settle the dust. The summer arrived like the open door of a furnace. Creeks that had run year-round for generations vanished into cracked mud. The lush green pastures of the valley faded to a sickly yellow-brown. The big herds, bred for abundance, began to suffer. Their owners, men like Sterling and Gable, started hauling water and buying expensive feed from out of the territory, their faces tight with worry. On Elspeth's scrubland, things were different. The deep-rooted forage held on, drawing moisture from far below the surface. Her well, which she had dug a crucial foot deeper, still gave clean, cold water. Button remained healthy, her coat sleek, her eyes clear. She was carrying her calf with an easy grace, a picture of health in a world that was growing increasingly ill. Button's calf was born on a blistering afternoon in late July. It was another heifer, a perfect miniature of her mother, right down to the white circle on her nose. Silas, his face shining with sweat and awe, named her Hope. The birth was easy, and Button was a natural mother, her low moos full of a tenderness she herself had never received from her own dam. She licked the calf clean and nudged her toward her full udder. And then came the miracle. The milk. When Elspeth sat on her stool for the first milking, she was not prepared. She expected a small amount given Button's size. But the milk flowed in a steady, frothing stream, ringing against the tin pail. And the quality of it was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was thick, almost yellow, with a layer of cream so rich it clung to the side of the bucket like paint. Old Daisy's milk had been thin and bluish in comparison. This was something else entirely. It was liquid gold. She kept it a secret. This small, stunning success felt fragile, a thing that could be broken by the weight of public knowledge. She told no one, not even Silas, about the astonishing richness, though the boy noticed the butter she churned was a deeper yellow, and the cheese she pressed was firmer and sweeter. She banked the knowledge like a coal low under ash, saving its heat for when she would truly need it. She and Silas and the two cows lived on their island of quiet abundance while the world outside grew more desperate. The drought tightened its grip. The leaves on the trees curled and crisped, falling in August as if it were October. The price of feed skyrocketed. Men began selling off their weaker stock for pennies on the dollar, their faces grim with the arithmetic of ruin. Mr. Sterling's pride was the first casualty. His magnificent prize-winning cows, bred for gentle green fields, had no resilience. Their milk dried up completely. He watched his investment, his legacy, literally shrink before his eyes, their ribs showing like wreckage through their fine hides. His envy, once a casual sport, began to curdle into a sharp and specific resentment directed at the one small farm that seemed immune. He started riding by Elspeth's property more often, his gaze lingering on her two healthy cows grazing on what looked like weeds. He couldn't understand it. It defied the known laws of his world, where bigger was always better and wealth was the measure of wisdom. Her survival was an affront to his failure. He saw her one day, mending a fence, and reined in his horse. "Still playing farmer, Miss Croft?" he asked, his voice slick with a condescension that no longer fit his circumstances. Elspeth drove a post into the hard ground with a heavy mallet before she answered. "Still am, Mr. Sterling. It's a wonder your animals are still standing," he mused, gesturing at the parched landscape. "Must have a secret well somewhere." Elspeth met his gaze. "Just a deep one," she said. The simplicity of her answer infuriated him. He was a man of complex deals and leveraged assets. He could not abide a solution as plain as digging a deeper hole. He rode off, the dust rising behind him like an angry ghost, and Elspeth knew, with a cold certainty, that he would be back. Her secret was revealed not by a boast, but by a simple act of commerce. With two cows now in milk, Elspeth had a surplus for the first time in her life. She churned the cream into butter, a deep, glorious yellow, and pressed the milk into firm, white wheels of cheese. She loaded a small cart, and with Silas beside her, she drove not to the local mercantile, but to the next county over, to the growing rail town where a new hotel had just opened. She walked into the hotel kitchen, her heart pounding. The cook was a large, perspiring man from the city, with a fearsome mustache and a reputation for being impossible to please. He looked at her homespun dress and the boy beside her with disdain. "We have suppliers," he grunted. "I'm not buying from—" He waved a hand, dismissing her entire existence. Elspeth didn't argue. She simply unwrapped a small pat of butter from its clean muslin cloth and held it out. "Taste it," she said. The cook scoffed, but something in her quiet insistence made him pause. He took a sliver on the tip of a knife and put it in his mouth. His eyes widened. He closed them, savoring the flavor. It was rich, sweet, with a complex, nutty taste from the strange forage the cows ate. It was, he realized with a shock, the best butter he had ever tasted. He opened his eyes and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. He bought everything she had. He paid in cash, more money than Elspeth had ever held at once, and made her promise to return every week with all she could produce. "I want it all," he declared. "The butter, the cheese, any milk you could spare. Don't sell it to anyone else." The drive home was quiet, the wooden box of coins heavy on the seat between her and Silas. The boy kept touching the coins, as if to make sure they were real. When they got home, Elspeth counted it out on the rough wooden table. The arithmetic was finally, gloriously on her side. News of the hotel cook's obsession with the Croft woman's butter traveled faster than the train. It became a story, a legend. People in her own town, who had never tasted it, began to look at her differently. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging curiosity. They still saw the small cows and the scrubland farm, but now they knew it was producing something a fancy city chef considered priceless. The perception reversal had begun. Mr. Sterling heard the news, and his resentment hardened into a plan. He saw her not as a strange woman with a pet cow, but as a competitor with a resource he desperately needed. His own business was collapsing. The drought had ruined him, but if he could get his hands on her productive animals, on her secret, whatever it was, he might be able to salvage his fortune. He approached her again, this time by her well. His tone was different, no longer mocking, but full of a smooth, false warmth. "Elspeth," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I've been thinking, this drought, it's hard on everyone, especially on a woman alone. You've done wonders, truly, but it can't last. I want to make you an offer. I'll buy your 2 cows. I'll give you a generous price, enough to see you through the winter, and then some." Elspeth looked at Button and Hope, grazing peacefully nearby. They were not livestock to her. They were family. They were the cornerstone. "They're not for sale," Mr. Sterling, his smile tightened. "Don't be foolish. A thing's only worth what others will pay. I'm offering you more than anyone else would. Take the money. Go somewhere easier. I like it here," she said, her voice steady. "This is my home." His face hardened, the mask of civility dropping. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low. "One person alone can't hold out forever." It was not a prediction. It was a threat. The drought did not break. August bled into a scorched September. The town well began to run low. What little water remained was brackish and foul. Hunger, a distant rumor for years, became a quiet, constant presence at every table. The faces of the children grew pinched and pale. Jedediah Gable, who had once laughed at Elspeth, lost his entire herd. He was a proud, broken man, and Elspeth saw the fear in his eyes when they passed on the road. Mr. Sterling, meanwhile, began his campaign. He started by whispering poison. He told people Elspeth's deep well was draining the town's aquifer, that her selfish hoarding of water was the reason their own wells were dry. It was a lie. Her property was on a separate watershed, but fear is not rational. People who had known her all her life began to look at her with suspicion. Then he went to the tax assessor, a man who owed him favors. He argued that Elspeth's land, now producing a valuable commodity, should be reassessed at a much higher rate, a rate he knew she couldn't pay. He was trying to starve her out, to force her to sell. Elspeth felt the pressure closing in. The loneliness, which had always been a quiet companion, now felt like a heavy weight. For the first time, she felt a tremor of real fear. It would be so easy to sell, to take the money and leave this hard place and its hard people behind. She sat on her porch one evening, watching the last light paint the dusty sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Button and Hope ambled over, resting their heads on the railing, their breath warm and sweet. Silas sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood, not speaking, but his presence was a comfort. She looked at what she had built, not just a farm, but a life, a small pocket of resilience in a broken world. She thought of Frau Greta's words. The stone the builder refused. She had been refused. The calf had been refused. The land had been refused. But together, they had become a foundation. She would not let Sterling break it. The next time she saw Jedediah Gable in town, she stopped him. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes downcast. "Jedediah," she said softly. He flinched, expecting another blow from a world that had given him nothing but blows lately. "My boy Silas will bring a gallon of milk for your children this evening," she said. He looked up, his eyes filling with tears of stunned gratitude. "Why?" he stammered. I laughed at you. Your children are hungry," Elspeth said, as if it were the only explanation needed. The act of generosity was also an act of defiance. It was a statement, clearer than any argument, against Sterling's campaign of whispers. Word of it spread through the town. It didn't erase the suspicion, but it planted a seed of doubt. Hunger changes a town, but kindness can change it back. A few days later, a crisis arrived that inverted every fortune. A small fire, started by a spark from a passing train, found the valley floor to be perfect tinder. The fire swept through the bone-dry pastures with terrifying speed. It didn't reach the houses, thanks to a sudden shift in the wind, but it consumed the last of the grazing land and, crucially, it destroyed Sterling's massive barn, where he had been hoarding the last of the territory's expensive imported feed. In a single afternoon, he was ruined as completely as everyone else. He had nothing left but his starving animals and his worthless land. And Elspeth still had her 2 cows, her deep well, and her secret patch of green. The morning after the fire, the full weight of the town's desperation settled like a shroud. There was no feed, no pasture, no milk. The future was a blank, terrifying wall. And then a small procession began. It started with Jedediah, Gable's wife, who came to Elspeth's door with an empty pail and a fiercely proud, frightened look on her face. She didn't ask, she just stood there. Elspeth took the pail, filled it, and handed it back. The woman began to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Soon, others came, mothers with thin, listless children, old men whose hands shook. They came to the farm of the woman they had mocked, to the home of the worthless calf, and they asked for help. Elspeth and Silas worked all day. They milked Button and Hope, and Elspeth set out every pail and jar she owned. She established a simple rule: a fair price for those who could pay, a promise of future work for those who could not, and for every child, a free cup, no questions asked. The arithmetic was no longer about survival, but about community. It was then that Mr. Sterling arrived. He rode up on his fine horse, the only thing he had left that still looked prosperous. He saw the line of his neighbors at her door, and his face was a thundercloud of fury and disbelief. He pushed his way to the front. "Croft," he snapped, "this is madness. You have the only supply. You can name your price. I'll buy it all of it. I'll pay you double what that hotel cook is giving you." He saw it as a business opportunity, a chance to claw back his fortune by controlling the one remaining resource and selling it at an exorbitant profit. The townsfolk fell silent, watching. They were hungry, but they recognized the shape of Sterling's greed. It was the same greed that had led him to hoard the feed that was now a pile of ash. Elspeth looked at him, then at the faces of her neighbors, at the children holding their cups. She looked at the man who had mocked her, tried to ruin her, and now sought to use her hard-won success for his own selfish ends. She could have destroyed him. She could have named a price that would have stripped him of his last assets and left him with nothing. The town would have understood. They might even have applauded. But she simply shook her head. "The milk is not for sale to you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "Not all of it. You may have a gallon for your family, at the same price as everyone else." It was a rejection more profound than any insult. She was not casting him out. She was making him equal, stripping him of his power and forcing him to be just one more hungry man in a line of his neighbors. His face went from red to white. He was being offered charity, and his pride could not bear it. He sputtered, speechless for a moment. "How did you know the Count?" a woman in the line asked, her voice sharp with sudden suspicion. "How did you know how many pails she had filled this morning?" Sterling froze. In his haste, in his greedy calculation, he had revealed he'd been watching, counting, assessing her output like a vulture circling a kill. He had exposed his own predatory intent. He looked around at the hard, knowing eyes of the people he had once lorded over. There was no support for him here. Shamed, outwitted by his own avarice, he turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, a man defeated not by drought or fire, but by a quiet woman's generosity. The line of neighbors at Elspeth's door became a daily ritual, a symbol of the town's changed heart. They brought what they could in trade: a mended harness, a sack of carefully saved potatoes, a promise of a day's labor when the rains returned. They were rebuilding their community around her kitchen table, one cup of milk at a time. The generosity, she showed them was repaid in 100 small ways. Men came and helped reinforce her barn. Women brought their sewing and sat with her in the evenings, their needles flashing in the lamplight, filling the cabin with quiet companionship. She was no longer Elspeth Croft, the woman alone. She was just Elspeth, their Elspeth. Silas, who had once been a silent shadow, found his place at the center of this new economy of kindness. He was the one who measured out the milk, who knew every family's need. The boy who had been raised by a rejected cow was now helping to feed the town. He stood a little taller, his voice was a little firmer, and the look in his eyes was no longer haunted. He was needed. He was home. The rains finally came in late October, a slow, steady soaking that smelled of life and forgiveness. The land, which had been as hard as iron, softened and drank its fill. A faint blush of green appeared on the hillsides. The long thirst was over. The town began to heal. Mr. Sterling sold his land and his remaining skeletal herd for a pittance and moved away, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered by old men on the mercantile porch. Jedediah Gable, his pride restored by honest work, became Elspeth's first and most loyal customer when he began to rebuild his own herd, buying 2 of Hope's daughters to start it. He paid her price without haggling and looked her in the eye when he did it. The legend of Button and her daughters grew. They were never large, showy animals, but they were the hardiest stock in the territory. Their line became known for its resilience, its intelligence, and for producing the richest milk anyone had ever tasted. Farmers traveled for days to buy her calves, and Croft's Creamery became the most respected dairy line in the state. Elspeth never grew rich in the way Sterling had been rich. She never built a grand house or bought fancy clothes. Her wealth was in her secure fences, her deep well, her healthy herd, and the respect of her neighbors. Her farm was a testament to a different kind of success, one built not on exploitation, but on patience and observation. One cool evening, years later, Elspeth stood on her porch, watching the sun set. She was no longer a young woman, and her hands were rough as bark, but her gaze was clear and steady. Silas, now a tall young man who ran the farm alongside her, stood beside her. The herd, dozens of dun-colored cows, all with Button's intelligent eyes, grazed peacefully in the lush pasture. The air was sweet with the smell of clover and contentment. Frau Greta had passed on years ago, but her wisdom remained. Elspeth looked out at the thriving farm, at the land everyone had called worthless, at the descendants of the calf everyone had called a runt. The stone the builder refused, she said softly to the evening air. Silas smiled, understanding. It had become the cornerstone of everything.